Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. David A. Thomas, and I have the pleasure of serving as the 12th president of Morehouse College. January is always a special time here at Morehouse, as we get to celebrate the life, legacy, and mission of one of our most esteemed alumni, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. In alignment with King's vision of justice for all, our institution still sits at the crux of social and political influence and intellectual conversations. Having just hosted President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris earlier this month to advocate for American voter rights, there's no better time for this lecture and conversation to be taking place. Welcome to the Honorable former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder, Dr. Carol Anderson of Emory University, Reverend James Woodall of the Southern Center for Human Rights, and hello again to Morehouse's own Dr. Adrienne Jones and Dr. David Wall Rice. I know your conversation will challenge perspectives and make listeners think critically about how they show up in this world, just how we challenge our students every day. Thank you, Dr. Vicki Crawford, for your organizing efforts, and welcome all to Morehouse College.
Good evening and welcome to the annual Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. Collection Lecture and Conversation Program. We're so happy that you could join us. I'm Vicki Crawford, director of the office that has oversight for the Morehouse King Collection. 16 years ago, the college acquired a remarkable archive of Dr. King's sermons, speeches, and other writings. Following that acquisition, it established an office to support teaching, research, and public outreach initiatives around the collection. This evening's program is one of those initiatives. This year's commemoration of the life and legacy of Dr. King centers around the topic of building the beloved community, the struggle for justice in our time. Dr. King spoke and wrote extensively about what he called the beloved community, or the World House, which essentially is a communitarian vision of human beings who are interconnected. Dr. King gave expression to this in his statement that we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. This human ethical ideal recognizes the humanity in all people across the boundaries of race, class, ethnicity, gender, and sexual identity, as well as religious affiliation and nationality. This evening, we are specifically focused on the critical issue of voting and the increasing efforts we've seen over the past decade to suppress that right. We will also address the ongoing struggle against systemic racism and economic inequalities in a broad context. First, we will begin the program with a special interview with the 82nd Attorney General of the United States, Mr. Eric Holder. My colleague, Dr. David Wall Rice, speaks with A.G. Holder to gather insight about his ongoing efforts to protect the vote. Following this, Dr. Rice will moderate a panel consisting of historian Dr. Carol Anderson, professor of history at Emory University, and author of the recent book, One Person, No Vote: How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. Also joining her is Dr. Adrienne Jones, attorney and Morehouse College political science professor who wrote a dissertation on the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and Reverend James Woodall, former state president of the Georgia NAACP and current public policy associate at the Southern Center for Human Rights. Again, we are delighted that you are here with us. Now I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. David Wall Rice and the 82nd Attorney General, Mr. Eric Holder.
Thank you, Dr. Crawford. Appreciate that. Former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder, welcome. It is so great to have you joining us here at Morehouse College. Of course, we all know that we were brilliant to award you a distinguished award for Candle in the Dark, and I believe it was 2015. So thank you for being here again and with us. We consider you as a part of our home.
Well, it's good to be here, and thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Again, thank you so much. As you know, our theme here is building the beloved community, the struggle for justice in the 21st century. And considering this theme, we realize that one of the most important issues in front of us right now, especially, is ensuring that all Americans have the constitutionally protected right to vote. We're in an interesting time. We're just after the president and the vice president actually came to the Atlanta University Center to drill down on the importance of protecting that vote. We know that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 remains one of the most important legislative measures that resulted from the long struggle for civil rights in this country. Can you talk to us a little bit about why that's still important today and what specific ways that act is under attack?
Yeah, I think we have to look back a little bit before we can get to where we are now. I mean, I think people tend to forget how central a part the fight for the right to vote was to the civil rights movement. The march from Selma to Montgomery was about the right to vote. The death of those civil rights workers in Mississippi, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, in 1963 was all about them trying to register people so that they could have the right to vote. Freedom Summer, 1963, was all about registering people about the right to vote. So the right to vote has been something that has animated the civil rights movement, from its very inception. The crown jewel of the civil rights movement was the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that put in place an enforcement scheme that prohibited states that had a history of voter discrimination from continuing with those practices. And that proved to be an extremely effective act. Huge numbers of African Americans, particularly in the South, were registered for the first time. We saw the election of Black elected officials in numbers that we had never seen before, all as a result of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And the act itself proved to be something that had a continuing relevance in our nation. In 2013, in the Shelby County case, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, gutted substantial parts of the Voting Rights Act, and the impact of that decision was felt almost immediately. We saw in about 25 states the implementation of voter suppression laws, the closure of some 1,700 polling places from the decision in 2013 until now. 1,700 polling places around the country were closed, predominantly in communities of color, predominantly in those states that were under the aegis of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It's become, the act was something that had historical relevance, but also contemporary significance. Without the act, we look in Atlanta in the last election, we see that in African American communities in Atlanta, it took about 6 minutes. In white communities, it took about 6 minutes to cast a ballot. In African American communities, it took about 51 minutes to cast a vote. And so that's one of the things that might have been impacted by the Voting Rights Act, but because it was crippled in that decision, we no longer have available. So the need for the 65 Voting Rights Act is still there. It was something that was proven to be extremely worthwhile.
So the idea is around it, and I don't want you to think me a dullard, but I'm just trying to get to some of the academics of it, right? We have the right to vote. So the nuance of it, though, is the accessibility to the vote. Like you said, the average amount of time that it's taken people in these marginalized communities, Black folk, to vote is 51 minutes versus 6 minutes. I think that's what you said, right? And so,
yes.
But the idea is we get to vote. So, but we can't just stop there, right? Is what we're saying in terms of folks who are charged to make the vote more accessible.
That's exactly right. Because one of the realities is, accessibility sometimes leads to the exercise or non-exercise of the most fundamental right. If you are an African American and you're going to have to wait 51 minutes to vote, maybe some portion of those people say, well, I've got other things that I've got to do. I'm not going to wait in line. If you only have to wait 6 minutes, that's something that almost anybody can work into their schedule. So accessibility is not something that can be relegated to a second-tier concern, because accessibility is directly connected to the actual exercise of the franchise.
So you talked about the Shelby County versus Holder, the 2013 decision that gutted much of the 65 Civil Rights Act, and we know that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would restore important components of that gutting, right? Can you talk about this act and if it has a chance of passing? I mean, are we hitting against the wind, or what are some things that we can actually do to ensure that we protect this vote? And is this a good first step?
Yeah, the bill named for John Lewis is an extremely important one. It would restore the 1965 Voting Rights Act in really substantial ways. All the things that the Supreme Court took away, the ability of the Justice Department to exercise what's called its pre-clearance authority would be restored, which means that if in a state or a locality that had a history of voter discrimination wanted to do something, change the location of a polling place, close a polling place, change an election day, they have to go through the Justice Department to get approval for that. And the impact of that meant that in a lot of these places, they didn't even bother to do these discriminatory things because they knew the Justice Department would slap them down. So the Department of Justice would have tools, would have restored to it tools that it had before the Shelby County case. Interestingly, the John Lewis bill would actually expand the jurisdiction of the 1965 Voting Rights Act and make it something that was nationwide in scope. What we have seen since 2013 is that our concerns about voter discrimination are not confined only to the South. We now are concerned about these unfair practices being used around the country, in Wisconsin, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania. And so we want to have a new statute that would give those tools back to the Justice Department and allow the department to be able to use those tools on a nationwide basis. And that is exactly what the John Lewis bill does.
So how is it that we ensure and push that bill or a bill like it, should it fail to pass? How do we make sure that it does pass? What do we do as the every person?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is something, we are at a stage now where we have to try to make sure that the Democrats in the Senate will do the right thing, make the necessary procedural changes so that the bill can, in fact, become law. I'd like to be able to say that, as it was in the past, this is something that can be done on a bipartisan basis. Every reauthorization of the 1965 Voting Rights Act was signed by a Republican president. The last time it was reauthorized, it passed the Senate 98-0. We are dealing with a different Republican Party now, and so we can't really expect, unfortunate as it is, that we're going to get any Republican support for the reauthorization, for the passage of the John Lewis bill. It's going to have to be Democrats. It's going to have to be those Democratic senators because it's already through the House. What can people do? This is the kind of thing, I think we underestimate the power that we have as so-called ordinary citizens. Politicians are responsive, not as much as we would like, but they are responsive at base levels to pressure that is placed on them, especially by their constituents, people who they know are going to have to vote or not vote for them. And so interacting with your senator, interacting with your congressman, making sure that they understand where you stand on this. If enough of us say, you know what, this is important to me, and if you don't do the right thing here, you're not going to have my support the next time you are up for re-election. That can have an ability to move people. And so ordinary individual citizens can be a part of the process by calling, texting, emailing your representatives.
Okay. Thank you for that. To pivot just a little bit, shortly after becoming the nation's first Black Attorney General, you delivered a powerful speech. Powerful because it wasn't only about speaking truth to power, but it was about speaking truth while in power. And you pointed out to ongoing problems in the country and issues that are still faced in terms of racism and economic inequalities and other inequalities and disparities as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about that speech that you gave and how it is that those things are still persisting, what it is that we might do to solve those issues, and how it is that maybe there has been some improvement?
Yeah, I thought that speech was important because as the first African American Attorney General, I wanted people to understand, I gave it early in my time as AG, I wanted people to understand that because of my life experiences, I brought different perspectives, different concerns to the job. And I wanted to raise people's consciousness about the things that I had experienced, the things that I had witnessed, the things that I was familiar with. And I tried to say that, the Justice Department under my leadership was going to be focusing on these issues. We are a nation that I think has become quite expert at avoiding the discussion of racial issues. And that's one of the things I wanted to talk about in that speech. I understand it. Our history is not necessarily a good one when it comes to things racial. But unless we are willing to grapple with our past, look at our past in a way that is truthful, that is honest, we're never going to get to the future that we want to have. And that's what I was trying to talk about in that speech, to say that, this black lawyer, this black attorney general was going to try to raise the consciousness of the nation to the extent that I had the ability to try to move us forward, because that's the only way we're going to really make progress. We have to understand the past if we want to have, that better future.
So, what extent are you encouraged or discouraged, considering the administration that had come after yours, in terms of that? People will put center this idea of racial reckoning. Certainly, you brought, and I like the language that you're using. You brought a consciousness to the fore. And certainly there is some awareness of the issues of social justice that the United States has to deal with. To what extent are you discouraged or encouraged, considering the time that's taken place between you're giving that talk and all these issues that's occurred in subsequent administrations?
Yeah, well, clearly the administration that came immediately after President Obama, the administration led by Donald Trump, was, to say the least, a disappointment. They reversed a great many of the things, many of the advances that I tried to make in the Justice Department under Attorney General Sessions, Attorney General Barr. They had a different view of the world, a different view of how the Justice Department should interact with the people it was supposed to serve, a different ideas about what the priorities of the department should be. But this is something that in our history we have become used to. We make progress, and then there is a reaction to that progress that tries to take us back. That line of progress is not necessarily a linear one. There are advances and then there are retreats. And I would characterize those 4 years of the Trump administration as a retreat from the values that I know President Obama had, and continues to hold, and the values that I tried to stand for while I was Attorney General. I'm actually heartened by the fact that we now have a new administration, a new Attorney General, a new Vice President, a new President, I think, who are acting in a way that's consistent with the way that we were trying to conduct ourselves during the Obama years. And so I think we'll see a period of progress now. But we'll have to fight for it, because there are always going to be forces on the other side that want to hold back progress, that want to defend the status quo, even if that status quo is an unjust one.
So how do you maintain hope in the midst of this interesting tension? Because, as you said, there's progress and then there's retreat, but there's progress again. Is it that we're going to just strike enough progress to make sure that the retreats are less? How are you able to maintain this hope?
Well, I look back at history and I see, I compare where we are in 2022 to where we were in 1965 to where we were, 50 years before that, and I see progress. The plight of people of color in this country is better now than it was 50 years before and 50 years before that. But I also understand that this is an ongoing struggle. This is a constant struggle. I am optimistic because I think, as difficult as this time might seem to us, put yourself in the shoes of that great Morehouse graduate, Martin Luther King. Think of what he had to face and his contemporaries had to face in the late 50s and the early 60s as they were doing their part to make sure that progress in racial things was happening. They had to face dogs. They had to put their lives on the line. People did, in fact, die. Civil rights workers, Medgar Evers. People gave their lives so that we would have the freedoms, the rights, the opportunities that we have. I'm sure that at some point during that time, Medgar Evers, Dr. King, John Lewis, they must have felt, a little down, a little concerned. maybe not certain that they would succeed, and yet they kept to it. And so I think that kind of spirit, that kind of feeling, is one that we have to have as well. You know, things on a daily basis might not seem like they are advancing, but if you look at the arc of American history, if you look at that arc of progress, if we stick to it, if we fight, we will make progress. And I think that's our obligation. You know, we dishonor the memory of those who came before us, who sacrificed so much, if we are unwilling to give as much as they did.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that contextualization. And thinking back to what you've just said in terms of you're giving that powerful talk that talked about inequalities through a lens of a perspective that was different because you are a Black man. Leaning into that a little bit, can you talk to us about what justice looks like for you and for other individuals who, by first glance, are marginalized, and by execution are marginalized in this country? What does justice look like for those who are defined in the margins?
Well, I think justice means equal treatment in a whole variety of contexts. Certainly, when it comes to the criminal justice system, when it comes to the educational system, when it comes to the way in which we are able to move about our society, and when we have interactions with government, that we be treated in an equal way. You know, Dr. King's famous desire to have his children judged by the content of their characters, not by the content of their characters, not by their skin color. I mean, that's what we're looking for. But it also means more than equal treatment, that we are treated also with dignity, and that you don't come into a room or into a situation with a skin that is my complexion, and people make assumptions about you, make assumptions about your capacities, make assumptions about positions that you're going to take on particular issues. All of these things, I think, really go to what justice looks like for people of color in this country, for people who for too long have been marginalized. Equal treatment, respect, dignity. These are all the things that our predecessors, my grandparents, my grandparents, they were not afforded those truly American, what should be truly American qualities.
And lastly, Mr. Attorney General, can you talk to us about what final message you might share with the folks who are enjoying the conversation that we're having here? What are their responsibilities and obligations? And I think of the obligation that we have to you, who stepped forward and put center the things that we really need to be concerned about in terms of Americans and living up to these ideals that are in these great the great experiment that is American democracy. Can you talk to us and give us some final words of instruction and messages, particularly for our students?
Yeah, I think for the students, I think it's especially apt to quote that Morehouse grad, Dr. King, who said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But here's the deal. It doesn't bend on its own. It only bends when we put our hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. As young people, people who are attending Morehouse, there's a special responsibility that I think that you all have, given the fact of that connection between Dr. King and you. It is, as I said before, we all have the ability, the capacity to affect change. We all have the ability to put our hands on the arc and pull it towards justice. And so what I would urge young people, students, to ask of themselves is, what are you doing? What are you doing to bend that arc? What have you done today that's going to help bend that arc? I have this artificial thing that I do that I think is kind of useful. Sunday evenings, when it's quiet, around 7, 8 o'clock, I try to look back on the week that I've had and ask myself, what have I done during the course of that week to help bend that arc, and look forward. What am I going to do in the week to come that's going to help pull that arc towards justice. I think all of us need to ask ourselves, those questions. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to be in the streets, every day. It doesn't mean that you have to be protesting every day. There are little things that you can do on a daily or a weekly basis that will help, pull it arc towards justice. Young people in particular can interact with their younger contemporaries and be guides to them. There are young people around this country who are starved for the kind of attention that we as adults, and particularly young adults, can give to them. They're looking for direction. And me, as a guy who's a lot older than those younger folks, there might be age gaps, generational gaps. I don't know the music. I'm still thinking that the Temptations and the Supremes are great. You all going to know their music. You're going to know the expressions they use, the slang that they use. You're going to have, contemporary connections to them. So helping young people, working with young people in youth centers, doing those kinds of things. That's one concrete way in which you can, pull that arc towards justice. Then obviously you can get involved in political things as well, and to make sure that our leaders are held accountable. There is a history of activism that I think young people need to put their hands around and figure out how they can be activists in the 21st century in the way that Martin Luther King was in the 20th century.
Former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder, thank you so much for being here with us today. But more importantly, thank you so much for your genius, for your dedication, and for your freedom work.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Today, we're going to be talking about building the beloved community, the struggle for justice in the 21st century. We were very fortunate today to have on our program a group of panelists that are going to help us understand how it is that we can continue to work for and to realize freedom of the great experiment that is American democracy. We have Dr. Carol Anderson with us today, professor of history at Emory University. We have Dr. Adrienne Jones with us today, assistant professor of political science here at Morehouse College, and Reverend James Woodall, the former state president of the NAACP and public policy associate at the Southern Center for Human Rights. Panelists, thank you so much for being with us today. We really look forward to the conversation we're about to have. Dr. Anderson, if you could get us started. Of course, you being a historian have spent years documenting systemic racism and other forms of oppression, while also documenting the important ways that people have actively organized and resisted to protect democracy. We know that in your work, White Rage, and in your recently published book, One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy, you begin the the discussion with a chapter on the history of disenfranchisement. Can you talk to us about that a little bit, please, to kind of get us started?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm just pleased to be here with all of you. The way to understand this is that the U.S. has consistently denied the right to vote to large swaths of folks. But where we begin to get into our so-called modern era is after the Civil War, with the passage of the 15th Amendment that says the state shall not abridge the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, this should be rock solid easy, except you had these Southern Democrats, these white supremacists who were determined to deny Black people the right to vote. The fear of Black political power is what was part of what was driving Jim Crow. And so Mississippi in 1890 looked up and said, we know how to do it. And what we're going to do is we're going to deny Black people the right to vote, but we're not going to write a law saying we don't want Black folks to vote, because that's so obvious it would violate the 15th Amendment. So what we're going to do is to use the legacies of slavery and make the legacies the access to the ballot box. And so the legacies, poverty. So you have a poll tax, and a poll tax will always sound reasonable. Democracy is expensive. So, you've got to, if you really believed in democracy, you would be willing to pay a small fee. Well, when you have dealt with centuries of unpaid labor, followed by the Black codes, followed by sharecropping, being able to pay to vote becomes very difficult. The poll tax amounted to 2 to 6% of a Mississippi farm family's annual income. That's no small feat. But it sounded reasonable, so reasonable that the US Supreme Court said, it doesn't violate the 15th Amendment. The poll tax is fine. The same thing happened with the literacy test. And so you have these states being very clever in denying Black people the right to vote without saying we don't want Black folks to vote. That is what led, by the time we get to 1940, where only 3% of age-eligible African Americans were registered to vote in the South. Only 3%. This is part of the spur that leads to the civil rights movement and that leads to that bloody cataclysm on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in 1965 that would lead us into the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
So this might sound academic, and thank you for that primer for us. But why are folks afraid of the Black vote? What's there to fear in that?
That is a great question. Anti-Blackness is so foundational in American society, where it has been crafted. The narrative is that Black people are a threat to the white community. And so this Black vote becomes a threat to the white community, to what they said in the South, our way of life. It becomes a threat. It was the threat that was part of what led to the murder of Emmett Till. One of his killers said, this is what we're fighting down here. You know, they're trying to vote. And if they can vote, then they're going to be in our schools. And we can't have that. And so it's seen that the Black vote will open up this society in ways that whites who have marshaled the resources, who have hoarded the resources, are absolutely petrified about. It is the threat of what this will mean to the American way of life. But really understanding that the real American way of life, when we hold these truths to be self-evident, is that you have a vibrant, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy. And that is the massive clash that is happening right now between that vision of a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy and basically a neo-apartheid state.
And so, interestingly enough, we're actually recording this on January 6th, the year anniversary of the Capitol insurrection, right? So, is the fear of the Black vote able to be translated to that action and that activity?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When you hear it in terms of Newt Gingrich saying they stole the election in Atlanta, they stole the election in Philadelphia, they stole the election in Milwaukee. Those are cities with sizable Black populations. When you have a Republican on the board of elections refusing to certify the vote coming out of Detroit, but willing to count all of the other votes coming out of Wayne County, it tells you that the idea that there is something fraudulent, something illegal about Black people voting. And so when you saw that Confederate flag being carried in the Capitol, when you heard, we're going to take our country back, this taking our country back, this is our house. That is all about, we don't believe that Black people are legitimate voters. They're not legal citizens. They're not legal Americans. They don't have the right to vote because Black people voted overwhelmingly against an avowed white supremacist. The response was to attack the Capitol and to try to stop the certification of an election. And when you think about it, that then led to a wave of voter suppression laws across the United States as a way to say, how do we stop these Black folks from voting? How do we stop Native Americans from voting? How do we stop Latinos from voting? How do we stop Asian Americans from voting? How do we stop young people from voting? How do we stop poor people from voting? That's where we are.
Thank you for that. Dr. Jones and Reverend Woodall, both of you have worked here in Georgia on the ground. And Dr. Jones, you recently wrote a piece that's looking at data that is examining voter suppression, and specifically since Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, and how that ruling actually ushered in this new era of voter suppression. Can you talk to this to us about kind of this, I know this creative, innovative way that we're seeing votes be suppressed now in the everyday, in fear of kind of pivoting from what it is that Dr. Anderson was talking about, this fear of the Black vote? Can you talk to us about what's going on?
Sure. So if you are not clear, in 2013, in the Shelby versus Holder decision, the Supreme Court removed the formula that determined which states would be subject to what's called preclearance under Section 5 of the VRA. Now, the vast majority of states and jurisdictions covered by Section 5, although not all, were the former Confederate states that Dr. Anderson is talking about, who were innovative about keeping Blacks from voting after Reconstruction. And so after the Shelby versus Holder decision, what that meant was that states were no longer under any kind of regulation with regard to making sure that their laws were fair and did not discriminate against Black voters in the way that we saw during Jim Crow. The Voting Rights Act, that's the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. It made a sea change in the ability of Blacks to be able to vote in the United States of America. And then, of course, with Section 5, it did this ongoing protection, which mitigated against states acting badly and passing laws that were going to prevent Black people from voting. So even before Shelby, we saw the advent of voter ID laws, which were tailored to try and make it more difficult for Black people to vote. It's a fact that Black people are it is less probable that Black people have the kinds of restricted ID that are required under voter ID laws. And then once the Shelby decision came down, the voter ID laws spread rapidly, as well as some of the more pernicious things that even more pernicious things that we've seen recently. So of course, we've just come from a year where a number of states passed draconian voter election bills, trying to make it more difficult for people to vote, namely in our state, Georgia, which has really led the way, very similar to Mississippi and Georgia and other states during Jim Crow. We have issues now with redistricting. In our particular state, we see that the districts have been drawn such that the geographical areas included there have always elected white candidates. In our state right now, with the majority being the GOP, those are going to be GOP elected persons. We see them removing Black people from county election boards very pointedly, having the power to take over county election boards, having the power on the state election board to control certification, which of course was pivotal to the January 6th situation last year, right? Because what the former president was asking was for our leadership not to certify the election in Georgia because the results were not what the former president desired. We've seen an uptick in intimidation and violence at the polls, against volunteer, basically. I mean, I think poll workers get paid a nominal fee, but they are volunteering of their time to be there. They're being intimidated. There's been some violence. We've noticed in Georgia that nationwide, polls were closed after Shelby versus Holder. So a number of polls across the country, mostly in Black and brown majority neighborhoods, which makes it more difficult to vote. So in 2018 and in the beginning of 2020, we saw very long lines in Black communities, making it more difficult for people to access the polls, which SB 202 has doubled down on. You have to vote in your assigned precinct now. There are limitations on provisional voting. And then I think most important happening right now is the lie. So that, a significant portion of our nation's country people believe that that election was stolen. It was not. And the mobilization of that lie, just like these other provisions, mobilizes the GOP base. And right now, the GOP base is white. And so the GOP wants as many white voters as there can possibly get. The Democratic Party, the second major party, of course, requires the vote of Black people and then some of the white voters. So the stakes right now, it makes me want to listen to that De La Soul track every day. The stakes are incredibly high.
So help me out here, Dr. Jones, and I feel comfortable with you because you've talked me through this before, right? We've visited this before with our students. But how do I get motivated if I'm the every person who's able to say, and this is not the every person is the dilemma here, but I'm the every person who says, look, I was able to go vote. There was no voter suppression that I saw. I cast my ballot, and I was able to go in and out of the poll, and that's it. I mean, what more to voting is that? I mean, it's just I'm casting my ballot, and my vote was counted or it wasn't, and then I just get to go on about my life. All this stuff that these folks are getting live about at the Capitol and talking about the suppression of votes. Y'all can kind of miss me with that. I did my duty. What other responsibility do I have for the every person? And then I'm curious, what other added responsibility do I have for a person who knows more, to the college goer, to the Morehouse College student, or to those individuals who are charged to be educated about the vote in different ways that allow for this democracy to be dynamic in the way it's intended to be?
So I want students who are watching this to understand that the power of your vote is vast. Students I have seen can be disaffected about voting. And I need you to understand, first of all, that some elections, in fact, come down to very narrow margins, which means that even if all you're doing is casting a vote, that vote might really matter. I get the impression that people think, it's not that big a deal. I did vote or I didn't vote, but my vote doesn't really matter. I'm going to promise you right now that you can be voting in elections, both national and importantly local, where the winning margin is so slim that, it behooves you to go down there and cast your ballot. For Morehouse men in particular, and for students across the country, I really want you to get involved beyond voting, right? I need Black people to be on the state election board. I need at least one Black Secretary of State before the end of my lifetime in Georgia. I need you working the polls. I need Black people around the table counting the votes that are going toward the certification that we're talking about at the end of elections. I need you mobilizing your friends and family who also might feel disaffected or think that all their job is just to vote. I think that because the stakes are so high right now, and it is my fear that the system will render voting unnecessary. And so in 2022 and 2024, I think we're talking about a situation where it's really not going to matter if you vote, if the system becomes so unplugged from our electoral choices that it doesn't matter anymore. We're going to need to have clear vote shares in 2022 and 2024 because the prospect of the former president, who is arguably racist, is real. So I don't want you to just cast a vote. I want you to understand that your vote, your colleagues on this campus and other campuses are critical. And I need you to get involved in voting an election in a more broad manner.
Very helpful. Thank you for that. And riffing on that a little bit, Reverend Woodall, you're former state president of one of the oldest civil rights organizations in the country. And from that standpoint, can you talk to us a little bit about the gubernatorial race with Stacey Abrams and the organizing that was important to take place there in terms of resisting that final result? And are there any takeaways that we can take from that that have informed how it is that we've been successful in securing the vote and in being active around the importance of organizing relative to that?
For sure, and thank you for having me. I'm just so honored to be amongst this distinguished panel. As relates to Leader Abrams' first campaign, and really any campaign that we've seen over the course of the last 2 decades, Georgia is to Dr. Anderson's point, is literally facing or experiencing the legacy of racism, of Jim Crow, of post-Reconstruction politics. We see the disenfranchisement of hundreds of thousands of people, and when we talk about individuals being able to simply go up to their election site and cast their ballot, that's not the groups who are most impacted by some of these laws. We have things like moral turpitude that is embedded within Georgia's Constitution that permits any person who has committed a felony from being unable to vote. And those are the kinds of margins that we're seeing literally decide these elections, as to Dr. Jones's point, that, President Biden this last election cycle won Georgia by less than 15,000 votes. When Stacey Abrams lost the election to Brian Kemp in that first term, the election was by a very slim margin, less than 1% of the total vote cast in that election. And so what we have to do is one, we have to be able to understand why people are showing up. Because one of the things that I saw personally, as we were going around the state, was that people were not simply moving because, folks died for the right to vote. That was something that young people specifically, primarily the millennial generation, were saying, we get it. We get that, the civil rights movement happened. We get that so many people gave up their lives for the right to vote, and we've done our part. And then we have a Secretary of State who resigns less than a week or two before the election, who to some folks' mind say he stole the election. And those are the real concerns that we have about some of the internal processes that we see here in the state of Georgia, and quite frankly, all over this nation. These are some of the questions that we should not be asking about whether or not elections can be secure, whether or not that we can trust that our ballot will be counted. These are the concerns that people are having. And so rather than, just hear them on social media, we took to the legislature to be able to address some of these concerns. And this was then. We didn't wait till there was a Democratic on the ballot for president. We said these are issues we have now. And so now in this moment where you have an insurrection take place, you have a president in Donald Trump who says, I don't want to leave the White House, and there are organized efforts to make sure that he is maintained in that position. Then you have this conversation of, well, there are both sides to this. Those are two stark differences in how we approach, discussions of election security, election integrity, etc. But unfortunately, that's not what's happening today. What you see are concerted efforts to maintain hegemony. What you see are concerted efforts to ensure that certain portions of our population, human beings who are legal citizens here in this community, in this state, are not able to participate in democracy. And that is something that we should all be concerned about, whether or not you're black, white, whether you're Republican, whether you're Democrat, whether you're Libertarian, or even an independent.
Thank you. So, Dr. Jones, I want to double down on that a little bit, the 2018 gubernatorial race in Georgia, and ask you if there were any lessons learned there that allowed us to, allow democracy to have another national breath, as it were, right? We know of the big quote unquote win in Georgia in the last national election. Is there anything that we learned in 2018 that allowed us to be able to secure that vote effectively, or in anything that we might use from that experience and going forward to build the secure vote?
Well, yes, I think to Reverend Woodall's point, addressing election issues in real time. So since 2018, exact match is not completely gone, but it's definitely been softened as a result of activism in the 2018. I also think that we understood that the mobilization that Fair Fight and other organizations engaged in was critical, right? It was almost like the awareness that the stakes are high in both 2018 and 2020. I think also the fact that Stacey Abrams was running in 2018 was motivational for people. And in 2020, I think some of the former president running for president again, I think was motivational. And we saw exactly what I was talking about earlier, which is that turnout really mattered. Casting your ballot, encouraging friends and family, coworkers of all ilks made a huge difference. And that is the kind of momentum that we need to maintain going into the next, into the midterms and into the next presidential election.
And do you think for us here in Georgia, Stacey Abrams' declaration that she will run for governor again, does that help us in some way in terms of mobilization and getting excited about that candidate?
Absolutely. Stacey Abrams is a candidate that many can get behind. And I think that having someone at the top of the state ticket who is well supported by communities in Georgia will make a huge difference. If we did not have a Stacey Abrams running for governor, I think we would be in real trouble. So I'm very pleased that Leader Abrams has decided to run again, and I'm very hopeful that she's going to be able to prevail in this next round.
Dr. Anderson, I have a question for you, and I don't want you to think me a cynic here, but there's a lot of discussion around democracy hanging on by a thread, and we've got to make sure that we do well and serve this great experiment so that we can experience, the voice of all and all this kind of stuff. What do you say to the individuals who might suggest, so what if democracy is hanging on by a thread? For Black folk, how has democracy really served us effectively over these last hundreds of years anyway?
I love that question. Thank you. It's not cynical at all. So let me do a kind of backup here. In 2016, I gave a talk at the Schomburg in New York City, and it was on voter suppression. And at the end, young brother stood up and he's like, I hear you, but Trump and Hillary are just the same. And they are not just the same. One is a politician, one is a demagogue. And I also began to lay out what that meant for our court system. When you begin to think about the way that our court system works, the way that the Supreme Court, the way that the justices are chosen, the ideologies that they have, and the rulings that they have a major impact on the quality of our lives, the way we're able to move through this system. Black folks have dealt with not being able to vote and have seen and lived through a system that systematically denies their humanity. This is what we had in Mississippi, where in the early 1960s, only 6.7% of age-eligible African Americans were registered to vote. And we saw what that looked like for the schools and the laws that dealt with the schools. We saw what that looked like for higher education. We saw what that looked like for housing, for healthcare. Our vote helps shape the quality of our lives. And when we cede that power, then we are ceding the quality of our lives. We're ceding control over the quality of our lives. You never cede your power. That's why they're coming after it so hard. That's why you see this wave of voter suppression bills, because they know the power and the impact that could have. And in fact, for young folk make up a larger demographic than the baby boomers. And so if young folks voted at the same or higher percentage as the baby boomers, we would have a very different kind of system because politicians become responsive to their voters.
Thank you for that. Reverend Woodall, can you help us a little bit, again, riffing a little bit from that explanation from Dr. Anderson, which was so effectively delivered for us. Can you talk to us about how we step into and beyond this racial reckoning that the country, has suggested that it's a part of, right? If we think about the extrajudicial killings of Black folk, if we think of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, of course, and Ahmaud Arbery, how is it that organizing and voting and social activism go hand in hand? What are some things that we need to know in terms of how it is that we are good stewards of democracy, not only in the vote, right, and in casting the ballot, but in also being aware of how it is that that our existence is governed by our voice and how it is that we show up?
Well, one, I would urge us to really evaluate our relationship to systems of dehumanization and ultimately white supremacy. When we talk about, a Stacey Abrams or a Joe Biden or a Kamala Harris, what we're really saying is how do we see ourselves in contrast to the world around us, right? As Black people, as human beings who are faced with anti-Blackness literally every step of the way, are we simply going to just compromise with systems of dehumanization and ultimately racial violence, or are we going to make some kind of address and evaluate how do we respond to these systems? What you see in organizing communities and activism spaces all throughout this country, and primarily even here in Georgia, is that people are saying that enough is enough, that we are no longer okay with just simply accepting, two politicians, to Dr. Jones's point, or to Dr. Anderson's point about the gentleman who walked up to her, is that there's some kind of frustration, is that when we participate in ways that we have been suggested all along, is that we don't get the outcome that we want. And is what we're seeing is that this transitory kind of exchange, or this transactional kind of relationship that we have with democracy and with capitalism and with all kinds of systems, are no longer sufficient for us to be able to survive. And so what we have now are situations where we are in an existential crisis. And so no longer is it about this politician or that politician. And yes, we are so excited to have Stacey Abrams. But the fact that we still have systems in place, regardless of the actors, that are allowing these kinds of situations and circumstances to present themselves, in which Black people have blood draining our streets each and every day, is a problem. And so we can no longer afford to just say, yes, we need to vote. We have to vote. But that's the bare minimum of what it means to be a citizen, because we understand this one simple truth, is that the very essence of what it means to be human in this country is what it means to be a citizen. We've seen the legacy of Jim Crow and how that dichotomy has played out in very real ways. And so now in this new age of the new Jim Crow, as Michelle Alexander calls it, is that we're forced to really ask ourselves, what does it mean to be human in a workplace? What does it mean to be a human in the ballot box, right? What does it mean to be a human in schools and in education facilities and in hospitals? All of those kinds of questions matter when it comes to democracy, because it's no longer just about the vote. It's about being able to have access to health care. It's about being able to send my child to a school in which they are not just miseducated, but they're educated and informed about what their humanity means to this world. What does it mean to be a parent? To be able to raise Black children, brown children, Latino children, Asian children, white children even. To be able to raise them in a world that sees their humanity, affirms who they are, without having to put a qualifier next to their name. That's what it means to have a healthy democracy. It's not about electing politicians. Stacey Abrams understands that, and that's why we support her. But we have to be able to build communities that understand this simple truth, that we are all somebody worth something more than just a single dollar bill, or more than just this or that. But we have to all participate in this thing together, because otherwise it all fails. And that is what we fear where we are in this country. And so in order for us to move forward, we have to be able to to lift up that simple truth in every single space that we occupy.
So thank you so much for that. And I'm convinced, right? So not only am I going to vote, but I'm going to be an educated voter who is grounded in the humanness of the citizenry and how it is that we should responsibly interact with one another. But what are other practical things? And this is for everybody on the panel. What are other practical things that I need to do to match my active voting, right? How is it that I can mobilize? How is it that I can organize? What are things that I need to do, whether it be in at ground zero? What do I need to do as someone who wants to be responsible, who wants to assume all of these important ideals of who we're supposed to be as citizens of a democracy? What are some practical things that I need to do in addition to my vote? Dr. Jones, I see your finger up. That means you want to say something. I know.
I do. To this point about Leader Abrams running, I think one of the, I mean, obviously, she's a good candidate, but people know her, right? And so people pay attention to her platforms. And so to your point about being educated, what I mean is in the state of Georgia, it means that you're going to have to, before going to vote, go and find out who the candidates are, a little bit about their history. What are their platforms? I used to live in California, and they would send out a very nice, comprehensive explanation of all the candidates and the propositions, right? I'm saying it's one thing to go into the ballot box and understand who you're going to vote for at the top of the ticket, but local government impacts your life significantly, regardless of who the governor is or the president. So, I need you to go in and do the homework that is required so that when you get to some of those down ballot races on your ticket, you know who you're voting for, right? I would have a little cheat sheet. Obviously, you can't take that in there with you, but you want to have a good idea about what it is you're going to do when you get in the ballot box.
And I think it's
Thank you
also
for that.
important. I think it's also
what else I was going
important.
to ask?
Yes, I think it's also important for us to not make democracy a transaction, because the moment it becomes transactional is the moment we lose. This is not a zero-sum game in which we give our vote and then we get something back in return. The reality is this: we show up to vote, and there are several compromises that elected officials have to make all the time. We understand that. We don't always get the candidate of your choice. We understand that. But the reality is democracy is more than just voting. It's about what happens in the corporate offices, what happens in our schools. So it means everybody participates. We the people. The first three words of the U.S. Constitution, we the people, having to embody what that actually means in practice means showing up and just being who you are, showing up in a community and supporting one another, making sure that our children are educated, making sure that those persons who are incarcerated are getting treated with care and dignity and humanity, making sure that we go to the hospitals and instead of us getting tested at the hospital during a public health pandemic, that we stay home and we wear masks and we wash our hands. That too is a part of democracy. Because the truth is this: when the pandemic began, we were all talking about staying home, but didn't nobody talk, or very few people rather, talk and discuss the people who are unable to stay home because they literally had to feed their families. They didn't have the privilege of being able to stay home and trust that the bills will be paid or food will be on the table. That's a democracy too. And so you look not just here in America, but all throughout the world, these are the kinds of ideals that we're pointing to, that we say, we the people want this world to be better, so this is what we do to make it happen.
And that kind of engagement requires that you know what's going on, that you know that when you hear these tales, these stories, you're able to pull back the veneer and see the little Wizard of Oz behind the curtain moving the levers. That you know that when you hear the big lie, when you hear, oh, voter ID is fine. I mean, it's just to protect our election integrity. You know the lie behind that. And so that you're able to engage with that. So you're able to talk with your colleagues. You're able to talk to your neighbors. You're able to talk with your family around the table about these major issues, so that we have an informed citizenry. We have an informed electorate. We have an informed population that is able, once we're able to really understand what is being said, what is being done, what these laws mean and what they don't mean, then we're able to engage and we're able to get the democracy that we deserve. So when we're thinking about what the crisis of climate change, for instance, what we know is that it hits poor folk the hardest. That's where this thing rains down. Too often, the issue of climate change has been described as some kind of either fairy tale or something that is about rich folks who live on the coast or something like that. No, it is about the way that you have these massive tornadoes that just wipe out the poor sections of town, where you get these fires that come through, where you get the waves that are rising up, you get the hurricanes, you get snow when it's supposed to be sunny, you get sunshine when it's supposed to be cold. It's the way that it hits poor folks who don't have the resources to be able to weather that storm. And it's to know how these systems work. And it's to be able to then, when we know, then we're able to engage intelligently. We're able to engage forcefully. We're able to engage rationally. That's what being an informed citizen means. That's what a vibrant democracy requires.
And so, do you think that I really appreciate what you all have shared there, in bringing it down to earth, as it were, because I think that so often what can happen is that democracy and these ideals seem so grand and have been situated in such a way that they seem distant from us, right? And it seems like something that is unrelated to us. And because of that, many folks just hold it at arm's length, because that's the way that it's presented to us, is that, oh, it doesn't really have a whole lot to do with you, but it has everything to do with us, is what you all are articulating for us. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. When you think about here in Georgia, the number of rural hospitals that have shut down, when you think about the refusal to expand Medicaid so that we have poor folk who don't have access to quality health care because our elected officials have made an ideological decision to not provide the funding that the federal government has put out there so that our folks can get the health care that they need. When you think about the ways that our elected officials have made decisions about what happens in our schools, and so we're seeing laws being passed talking about teachers cannot talk about racially divisive issues, things that will make white students feel uncomfortable. So none of this critical race theory stuff. And as we know, critical race theory is not taught in K through 12, but it becomes a way of defining you cannot talk about racism. You cannot talk about, if we cannot talk about racism in the United States in K through 12, then we're not able to talk about slavery. We're not able to talk about the genocidal removal of indigenous people. We're not able to talk about the xenophobic immigration laws. We're not able to talk about Jim Crow. So we don't understand how we got here. So and when we don't understand how we got here, then you have all of these fairy tales coming up to try to explain what it is that we're seeing, instead of being able to be grounded in the truth, grounded in the evidence. And so, yes, democracy, who our elected officials are, matters, because they are making these policy decisions that have impact on so many sectors of our lives. Think about the fight for $15 minimum wage and how that got scuttled. That's what our elected officials do. So you begin to think about what it means for your life to be able to move from $7.25 an hour to $15 an hour, and how that affects what you're able to do, where you're able to live, the kinds of food you're able to buy. It matters.
And I'll
So
say
it
this, Dr.
sounds like,
Rice.
please.
I want to stay on that point just for a second, because I know the students oftentimes say we're in Metro Atlanta. We talk about local politics mattering the most, and majority of our elected officials are African American. And one of the things that we often see in these communities is that some of the people closest to us can also be responsible for some of the damage that is happening in our communities. What I mean by that is part of being a part of democracy is holding our leaders accountable, regardless of if they're the Trumps of the world or even if they're the people we voted for and elected. it's important for us to be able to tell the truth in all circumstances, because the truth is, when we were protesting around the murder of Rayshard Brooks and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, there was African American leaders, okaying the use of tear gas on protesters here in this city. There was a Morehouse student, a Spelman student, who was literally thrown out of their vehicle by an African American law enforcement officer. And so it's more than just making sure we are at the table, but it's also being sure that we have our issues reflected in the decisions of policymakers, regardless of who they are, what they look like. It's important that we are a part of the conversation as a community of African Americans, but even more so that our issues that make sure that liberation is a topic in the agenda on discussion is the utmost priority. Because otherwise, then we're still on the table, and then we just got people in high places that look like us that are not fighting for our cause.
So it sounds like it's not only, as Dr. Anderson said in our open, the fear of the black vote, but it's the fear of it's the fear of the karma of democracy done wrong under white supremacy and hegemony. Is that
Oh yeah.
okay to say?
Oh yeah, there's so many ways. As a historian, you're going through the records and you see this fear of retribution. If they get free, they're going to do to us what we did to them. And that fear of retribution then also leads to holding down tighter to the reins of power. I mean, I saw this in literature dealing with South Africa in the 1970s, where whites were saying, we know apartheid is wrong. It is 8 ways to Sunday wrong. But if we dismantle apartheid, they're going to do to us what we did to them. So we're going to hold on tighter to apartheid. We're seeing that same kind of logic, the fear of retribution, that is also governing what is happening here in the United States.
I think there's
Dr.
also
Jones.
a tacit fear of working class people getting together and recognizing that they have a lot of the same issues, right? Jim Crow is established in order to separate
Right.
lower class folks from one another, so that mass political power doesn't have an opportunity to impose itself on the leadership. And to Dr. Anderson and Reverend Woodall's points about staying active in the democracy, I think it's cyclical, right? If my community's health is so poor that I don't have the energy, for example, to go and press my legislators, even the ones who look like me, now I have to work from sickness into a position that I can be pressing my legislators. If I can't get educated, or if I don't have an economy that will work for me, I'm saying all of these things set you back. And so you got to stay in the game, because if my entire community is incarcerated, as we know happens, right, and everyone is upstate, not only have I lost voter potential, but I've also lost protest and encouragement potential over those who are regulating things in my particular area. And I want people to understand that this fight, I mean, we see it happening at the national level, but if you're paying attention to what's going on in some of these school boards, right, I'm saying the fight is happening right up the block. And so you got to stay engaged, because it's not just Trump, it's the people up the street who are going to try to impose these kinds of ideas. One, which keeps them engaged in a lie, but two, which weakens your ability to be able to stimulate the democratic framework that is arguably still available today at this point. Let's get on it and stay on it.
So what might we be graceful enough, and I use that language intentionally, right? It's not our responsibility to teach white folk to be human. It's not our responsibility to teach white folk to be kind or to be, good citizens. But Dr. King said, and I always butcher up this quote, but he says that Black folk and the morality of the movement that we're involved with has the ability to give health to the sickened white man. So what might we be graceful enough to suggest to white folk that they can do to be partners in this democracy that they say that they care so much about? I wonder if that's going to get edited. But anyway, go ahead.
I'll start. I really don't. I'm going to use the words of Dr. David Whitworth, who is a professor of missiology at the ITC, and he simply says this. He says, "I have nothing to prove. I just have something to share." We're not working and doing this work to do anything for white people, right? We're simply sharing with the world our humanity, because that is how we defeat white supremacy. No amount of laws will defeat white supremacy alone. No amount of wealth accumulation would defeat white supremacy alone. The only thing that can literally defeat white supremacy is our beingness, our ability to remain human, to stay alive. And in a real sense, to even suggest that we need to teach white people anything is dehumanizing in and of itself, because it suggests that white people are the standard and we must get them to where we need them to be so that we can exist. No, they are not the standard. Humanity is the standard. And if we embrace that truth, then I guarantee you that we would have stronger communities. But because there are systems in place, whether they're economic, social, whether they're theological, you can go down the list, is that they're removing the humanity of so many people in so many communities, and they often forget, as Dr. I can't think of his name right now, but The Ground Has Shifted is a book that talks really about the post-racial reconstruction here in America. And in a real sense, it is so difficult for us to be able to have this conversation about what does it mean to be human at the same time of having to live in this anti-Black world, but have to really focus on, well, what do we do to make white people like us a little bit better so that they can play nice with us in democracy? Like, if they are human too, then they will accept us and embrace us just because we are human as well. But if we have to put the qualifier of, well, white people need to accept us because we're Black and this has happened, then it becomes a way much more difficult conversation in which we'll never get to liberation. So that's just my thoughts on that question, but I'm sure others have different. I don't know.
No, and I love that. And I also think that one of the things, and this is why I keep pushing on evidence, fact-based knowledge, but because part of what has happened when you think about the skewing of our K through 12 curriculum, for so long we had what was called the Dunning School and the Lost Cause School of our history that basically taught that slavery was benevolent, that the Civil War was about states' rights, that it wasn't about slavery, and that slavery was basically not a bad system. And when you're getting this drummed into you over and over and over in one textbook after the next textbook, and then when you consider that most Americans do not go to college. I think it's something like 25% have bachelor's degrees. So that the history of this nation that we have, most people are walking around with, is a skewed history. And that is why it's so important to be able to unscrew and unskew that history. That's the work that I know that we must do. That's the work we're doing in our public forums. That's the work we're doing in our books. That's the work we're doing in our talks, is to unscrew that history so that we have a real history and not a myth history.
I
So
would
thank
add
you.
that. I just want to add the thing about informing people does not always work, right? Telling them the truth does not always change their minds. And I would argue that what I'm about to say arguably does not apply to elites, but for the average poor person, you cannot eat white supremacy. It is not housing you. In fact, it is simply keeping you from participating in the system in a way that's going to be effective for you. If you live in Southwest Georgia and there's not enough health care, that is definitely affecting Black people. But the majority of the people who live in the state of Georgia are not Black. So the lack of health care is also impacting you. So, I go around telling people things like this. I do not know that it's persuasive, but I think people need to understand, for example, if the ability to vote or access to the polls is eroded for me, it is also eroded for others who do not look like me.
I know.
And
So
Dr.
one of
Jones,
the key things,
it begs the question that white supremacy is not about race. It's about power, about
It
access,
is.
about resource.
yes,
And the moment we
yes.
make it about race is the moment we lose that fight.
And I would say that I look at the Lee Atwater quote. Lee Atwater was the strategist for the Southern strategy for Ronald Reagan, and he said, in '54 you could say the N word and it wouldn't hurt you, but by '68 you couldn't. It would backfire. And so what you would do is you start getting really abstract. And you start talking about taxes and forced busing and states' rights. And all of these things are really abstract, but they're designed so that blacks get hurt worse than whites. And so in that construction, part of what you hear is that black folks are supposed to get hurt by this policy. But what you also hear is that whites are the collateral damage for these policies. They're the fig leaf that the politicians are able to put in front of them to say, oh, this isn't a racist policy. Look, white folks can't vote either. Look, white folks don't have health care either. Look, white folks don't have enough money to keep a roof over their head and buy a home either. So how can this policy be racist? And so it is by deconstructing these policies to see what's underneath them, how they work, how they operationalize, and then being able to tell that tale. And you're right, having the evidence won't move a lot of folk, but having the facts will move enough of folk where they're like, oh, is that how that jumped off? There's a wonderful book by a white woman from Kansas named Heartland, and it's by Sarah Smarsh. And she's talking about her poor family wrestling with the forces that are stripping them of their power, their economic livelihood, and the violence that they're facing, the economic crushing that they're facing, and how they respond. And so it's understanding how these systems work that become really important for being able to break down the politics of grievance, the politics of, well, I can't, so therefore it must be their fault.
You all, thank you so very much for joining us today. We're winding down on time, and this might be a little unorthodox, but by way of you all giving us kind of a final word, can you discuss for us a little bit about how it is that you got into this work that you're doing? Each of you are so impassioned and dedicated. I think it would help our audience and our students in particular know how it is that you stepped into this work and why it's important. And that's kind of a way that gets us out of this conversation and into the community and what it is that they can do next, using you all as kind of North Star.
For me, I grew up it was watching my neighborhood turn into the hood. And it was watching how folks who had done everything that they were supposed to do and still get crushed. So still watching the jobs disappear, watching the neighborhood disintegrate, watching the city not provide the services that they were supposed to provide, having my father on the phone with the city going, when are you picking up the trash? And the city not being responsive. And I just knew, Lord, there's something going on here. I've got to figure this thing out.
And for me, as I grew up, my father, the memories that I have of him before he was incarcerated, he would often be talking about corruption in the municipal, officials like the Atlanta Police Department, the Atlanta City Council, those kind of things. But then he disappeared, and I always would wonder why. And when I got to high school, I saw him on television, and at the time, he had been the longest serving, or he had been serving a sentence, like a pretrial detention sentence, which had been at the time the longest serving, pretrial sentence in the history of Fulton County. And he ultimately got convicted 2 life sentences plus 40 years. And I asked myself, start looking into this case and seeing what happened. And the elements of that case really struck a balance with me that really forced me to understand the system that we lived in, the communities that we were in, and how this legal system ultimately upends our communities as a whole. Regardless of whether or not he committed a crime or not, that remains to be seen. I don't know. I wasn't there. What I do know is how that impacted my life. And so as I've gone to college and at grad school and working in policy, I want to be able to ensure that regardless of where folks are in this world, that they are treated with dignity, that the systems that we pay as taxpayer dollars to support are ensuring that there is safety amongst the whole public, and not just people who look like me and you, but every single person. And I wanted to ensure that for not just myself and my dad, but I wanted to ensure that for everybody's and their family. So that's how it got started, and that's why I continue.
For me, it was growing up after the civil rights movement, in an environment where I did learn that there had been gains for Blacks, particularly in education, and then having the opportunity to go to institutions of higher education, which it immediately became apparent to me that there were very few Black Americans there, very few in college that I expected to see, very few in law school, very few in graduate school. And so as I started thinking about what I was going to write about in graduate school, it made me say, well, where are all the Black people that are supposed to be here now that we have improved the democracy? Well, they're not there. And then I read a book by Carol Swain, who is a conservative Black person, about the Voting Rights Act, and I was sold. And so it became important to me to understand the history and the development and the influence of conservatism on the Voting Rights Act, and to make sure that people understood that this history that we thought had been successful still required intense work.
Yes.
Well, Dr. Adrienne Jones, Dr. Carol Anderson, Reverend James Woodall, thank you all so much for the conversation today. And of course, thank you to Vicki Crawford, who is the director of Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. Collection, for allowing us this platform as we continue the work to be and to get free. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rice, for moderating this important discussion, and special thanks to our 82nd Attorney General, Mr. Eric Holder, for joining us this evening and for sharing such an inspiring, insightful message. We're grateful to our panel of experts, Dr. Carol Anderson, Dr. Adrienne Jones, and Reverend James Woodall. Finally, special thanks to Morehouse College and to President David Thomas for his leadership of our institution. To quote poet Amanda Gorman, we recognize that the hill we climb is steep, but it is my hope that we will face the challenges that lie ahead and continue to resist, rebuild, and recover. Again, we appreciate your tuning in. Have a good night.